Two examples we use.
The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. And let's connect you with two very powerful members from the Virginia General Assembly. Delegate Kurt Cox, the Majority Leader. Welcome, sir.
Woody, always good to be with you. Thank you.
Senator Steve Martin, congratulations, sir. You are a committee chairman again.
Yes, I am, and enjoying the work, getting great things done.
And apparently, the Senate is still functioning, although there are 2 seats yet to be filled. There's a special election today,
yes.
And depending upon the outcome, it could tip the balance in terms of who's in charge.
Well, there's still 2 seats in the balance. There's one that's in a recount that's somewhere between 6 and 9 votes apart, depending upon how you look at that. And then we'll see what happens there. And then today there's an election in the 33rd in Loudoun County. Don't know how much snow is falling up there and what the weather's impact is on it. I'm not going to try to prognosticate. I'm under the impression that there's even odds there as to which way that goes.
But of course, the people's business continues in the Senate. I know that there was a tragedy suffered by one of your colleagues, which has resulted in additional discussion about the need to reform mental health. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, there are a number of bills, and I've had to create a mental health subcommittee, the 5th subcommittee to specialize in that area. And we're looking at a number of things with regards to bed space, the system of how we keep track of that. We absolutely have to have a comprehensive database that, quite frankly, we had already requested, and we're surprised to find that it had not been put together like we had, I'd say, instructed. But then also the issue of detainment, and the issue of detainment as to how long you can keep someone involuntarily is both a matter for our committee as well as Courts of Justice Committee, because it's a legal issue and due process issue. And so I've set up that subcommittee, and we're not doing the work too hastily, even though I think tomorrow I hope to have action taken on some of the bills so that they are reported to my full committee on Thursday.
Now, notice you're on a number of other committees. You must be pretty busy. How many committees do you attend?
Well, the session before last, they had to change the rules of the Senate to accommodate that issue. Prior to that, you could only serve on 4 standing subcommittees plus rules, and I serve on 5 standing committees plus rules and numerous subcommittees. As a matter of fact, because we are 2 people short in the Senate and on the Education and Health Committee, I have in fact been exercising my prerogative to attend the subcommittee meetings to make sure that we have sufficient votes to do business in there. So that's really kept me quite busy.
I'm sure. Mr. Leader, mental health goes far beyond just how long a person can be detained. And of course, this has been an issue since Virginia Tech, if not before then. Tell us what else is necessary to deal with these serious issues.
Well, Steve said it's a complex, tough issue. There's also a money piece to the issue. And obviously, Governor McDonald, the outgoing governor, put, I think, around $38 million into his budget. And several of the techniques he put in his budget we know work. For example, PAC teams. A PAC team would be sort of an interdisciplinary team that goes out and makes sure that person who is bipolar or might have some other, problem is simple things like taking their medication. That's one of the biggest things that happens. So they really monitor that person. It's been pretty successful. So we know probably increasing the number of PAC teams probably makes a lot of sense. We have things called drop-off centers where obviously you can, take the person who's having trouble, get that policeman or that sheriff's deputy back on the street. That makes a lot of sense. So we're sort of working through some of those issues. Steve hit, I think, some of the other really big issues. But, it's complex because when you start calling around trying to find a bed and trying to find it in real time, he's right. We don't really have a system right now that really helps with that. Even if you create a system, which I think he's advocating for, which is good, it's hard for the hospitals to do it in real time. So a bed that might be available at 8 o'clock, will they keep up with the system? Will it be available at 5? The other thing is that bed appropriate? For example, you might have 5 very severe cases on your floor. They might have an open bed, but are they willing to take a 6th case like that? So you got to work through those issues. But that's a really good first step. The other issue that I think is pretty big is, what are you going to do if you can't find a bed within the time period? Will there sort of be a place of last resort? Will that be a place like Central State Hospital? But you have to be careful even how you do that, because you got to be careful not to make that, frankly, sort of the first resort option, because that's not really where you want to be. So I know his committee, and he's sort of the expert in that area, really has to work through some very difficult issues. And finally, it's interesting. You have to, I think, be careful in unintended consequences. My wife actually does this for a living. She's a crisis counselor, so that's what she does. She goes out at night and basically evaluates people, does a psych evaluation. But, one of their biggest complaints is they're so inundated with paperwork, they'll spend, 3 or 4 or 5 hours on paperwork. And so you have to be real careful when you do something that you're not burdening them more where they're actually getting to see clients.
I know you had something else to say.
Well, the issue of what he was really describing there is what we referred to as community-based care, and whether or not they're actually getting their medication where they are. And so many folks are even homeless and on the street may not be getting their proper treatment. And this is something that's been a concern of mine for over 20 years now. Over a dozen years ago, I created the Behavioral Health Care Commission, which is now a part of the Joint Commission on Health Care. But I'd say pretty much 2 decades ago, I had begun to introduce legislation to try to right-size our institutions long before the court was ordering it, because I felt like with only about 30% of our institutions being utilized, the space within them, that there was a great waste in real estate, capital expenditures, and operation that really should have been being spent all that time in community-based care. And there have been throughout the years objections to that, because within the specific communities, they just didn't want to lose what they had. And I believe net effect would have benefited them all along. And our responsibility is to actually be providing care for these people where they are, not where, we just care to spend the money. Now, I do appreciate along the way that a lot of our sheriffs in various areas, and again, my committee's urging and letters that I've sent to them, they've really started creating these pods and specialized programs within their system, some of them better than others, that are really making a difference in people's lives while they're there, so that you don't have that recidivism. But still, if you're not in an institution like that, they're out in the community. The money needs to follow where the people are. And so that becomes a budget issue. But we've been working on this for years, and I will say that it was some years ago that back to the issue that Kirk spoke of as whether or not it's real-time information or not, we had said to these hospitals twice a day, enter the information twice a day. We realize that at 8 o'clock it may not be accurate at 11:30, but you can call us and find out. And we realize if you updated it at 2 o'clock, it may not be correct at 5 o'clock when people can make calls. But let's go in and put the information in there twice a day for us, and it'll be as up-to-date as it can be.
Continuing the thread on those who are institutionalized, there is a lingering implementation of a court order settlement regarding our training centers. What impact is that having on people who have been institutionalized there?
It's a very big issue. The Department of Justice came down and basically said, I'm going to be a little bit simplistic here because there was a little bit more detail to this, but basically you have to look at closing your 5 training centers on a timetable. And I think they actually pushed for a 5-year timetable. We negotiated a 10-year timetable. Now, there's a little bit more to it than that, but obviously, and there's a certain schedule of when they will close. And so obviously, going to Steve's point, then obviously a lot of the folks that are on ID, intellectual disability waivers, or DD eligible will now be in the community, and there are different levels of severity. So that's a real challenge. As Steve said, a lot of the cost savings that you need to pick up to help fund some of these community-based services will actually be closing those facilities. And that is something that some of us have been advocating once again for a few years, because until you close a facility, you really cannot get the cost savings. And so, almost to Steve's point, that this has been a discussion for 20 or 30 years, and the same problem he pointed out.
Multiple study committees have recommended this.
And I remember Jim Gilmore.
Multiple.
You know, we did a lot
and he was the third one.
He was. And so, but we're on our way. I mean, you know, obviously you have to have, here's your challenge. You both need to serve the folks who transition in the community with their various problems, but then you have a current waiting list of, I think, around 7,000 folks. Probably half of those would be called sort of the urgent care list that are currently waiting for community services now. And so you have the challenge of, you know, basically, you know, how do you sort of balance that, et cetera? The actual waiver that I mentioned provides you with certain services, and they're very crucial services. But the waiver has not been tailored very well sometimes to individuals. So what can we do maybe to save a little bit of money by tailoring that waiver to just your needs, which will free up money for other people, maybe be able to bring the waiver list down. So we've got a lot of challenges in that area.
I know you're interested in a bill dealing with apprenticeship academies. Talk to us about that in terms of workforce development.
Well, workforce is such an interesting issue, and it's one I'll be the first one to claim I'm not an expert on. But it's a bit frustrating in appropriations and the Budget Committee to sort of get our hands on, you know, exactly how workforce money is being spent. There's so many different, you know, whether it be the community colleges or various agencies, and how effective is that money being spent. So one of the things we're very interested in, and I have a budget amendment on this, is that CCAM, which is sort of an amalgamation of companies down the Prince George area, sort of driven by Rolls-Royce, but not just Rolls-Royce, Canon, Siemens, et cetera, have actually come up with sort of a research institute where they test various advanced manufacturing processes. And one of the things they will tell you is, our workforce is good, but it's not where it needs to be. And frankly, we're not going to keep expanding if your workforce doesn't get better. And this is not necessarily who you would think, not necessarily your engineers. I would say your $52,000 a year technician. So the theory is that basically they would like to see us create an apprenticeship academy right down on that footprint of CCAM down in Prince George that would be very specialized, and the students would learn, you know, really specialized processes on some of that advanced manufacturing machinery. The workers coming out would not necessarily go to Rolls-Royce. Basically, anyone that participated in the apprenticeship academy would have a shot at those students, so it's not for one company. The theory being, whether it be automotive or aerospace or some of the advanced manufacturing, we could really become a hub on the East Coast, and especially a supply chain hub, if we could turn out more technicians. So that's sort of what that's about. There's some Tobacco Commission money, there's some federal money, so hopefully that will be a step to really try to jumpstart advanced manufacturing.
So a little bit more emphasis on vocational education, for example.
Well, absolutely. I think that we're making a big mistake when we assume all of our children should go to four-year colleges to get a degree, and we push them in that direction. In terms of providing for their family, being a meaningful and productive part of society, you know, you can move into a millwright job at one of our manufacturing plants and start off way on up above the number that he just mentioned a few moments ago. And so, that's something that shouldn't be discouraged, and people that are oriented that way take advantage of it. I love working with my hands, and so we should not, we'll try to remove that stigma there, and what he's talking about is great for an important area of economic depression as well. South of there in Southside Virginia is an area where we really need to be making a difference in job preparedness and job opportunities.
And as you say, this is not to denigrate our junior colleges or our institutions of higher learning. It's just to put a different emphasis on another track, so to speak, to a really good job.
Right.
Talk to us about our junior colleges, because I know that's something very near and dear to your heart.
Well, they're doing a great job for us, because they're providing not just folks that we were just talking about, but also adult education. That just that where I think we've had a void there too much, and it's career changers and that sort of thing, folks that just can't go off and do the other classes, and this has to be available to them. So I'm very thankful for our community colleges, and of course we both share a great deal of appreciation for the only two-year institution that's not a community college that's in Richard Bland. We're both big advocates for Richard Bland. But, and let me shift a little bit, because I'm very thankful for the for-profit colleges out there. If those for-profit colleges were not providing the education for career changers and adult education, we'd never be able to meet it. And we've got to have an appreciation for that fact. And so community colleges play a significant role there, but so do our for-profits.
And of course, the community colleges, the for-profits, and others have played a critical role. During the recession, as you say, a lot of retraining. People lost jobs. They need to be retrained to a different skill level. Talk to us about that.
Well, there's no question we saw a big bump up, which you're generally going to see in the community colleges when it came to the recession. And I think Steve makes several good points. One of the challenges for the community colleges is we sort of ask them to be all things to all people. So a lot of cases, you know, you're basically getting an associate's degree that leads to a four-year degree. That's great. You're asking them to do a lot in workforce training in a lot of other areas. And I do think that's a little bit of a challenge, and that's why, you know, I was talking about the Apprenticeship Academy. Right. You know, in some ways, as well as the community colleges do, sometimes it's we tend to spread funding out among all the community colleges, and we're not very specific. So sometimes when you get to things like advanced manufacturing, I think you need to look at more of an industry-based model that community colleges certainly participate in, but you make sure that you get, as Steve says, whether you're a millwright or you're a welder, when you take that certificate to that industry, it's actually the one they need and the one they can use. So that's a challenge. I like the plug, obviously, for for-profits. Let me put a plug in for the private colleges, which a lot of people don't realize that if all the kids the private colleges serve, if those students suddenly went on to the public marketplace, we would not have the slots. And we offer what's called a TAG grant, which I know a lot of your viewers are familiar with, tuition assistance grant, which actually makes that a little bit more affordable. I think it's currently $3,100, and I think the governor's asked to bump it up to $3,300. That's a pretty good expenditure of money, because if you think of what that expenditure is compared to what we would pay for a student to go to a public university, we have a good system of both for-profit and then, of course, our universities, then our private colleges.
The 2+2 program is obviously one that helps students who maintain a certain grade point average at the junior college level to be granted automatic admission to our institutions of higher learning as well.
Well, right, and that's another role that it can play. Those students who do want to do the four-year thing, but just didn't really perform like they ought to have, or just even might not have really learned how to study like they ought to use that as an opportunity to provide themselves a little bit better preparation for the four-year institution.
Now, what about the challenge that the previous governor laid down in terms of graduating an additional 100,000 students from our institutions of higher learning, concentrating on science, technology, engineering, math, and, in addition, health?
Well, if we're going to do that, then we're going to have to, do a much better job in our high schools. Now, I'm very thankful for the job we're doing there, but we're bragging about being above average nationally on an average that's in decline. So be careful about bragging about that. I do think I am concerned about way too much remediation at the beginning of each school year and when you first go into college. I'd like to see our students have a more solid preparation going in, and if we can do that, then you'll see that happen.
Great, and a good segue into standards of learning, I think, and as a former teacher yourself, and I know you miss those kids, give us the puts and takes on the difficulties about the standards of learning in terms of its content and in terms of the number of tests and when they are administered, in addition to other tests.
Well, let me say this, this is a very important point. The standards of learning test and basically the way we have done our standards, I do think have been cutting edge, and they've been very effective. I give this story. When I first came into teaching, gosh, 33 years ago, there were no standards. And what happened essentially was, and I was a government history teacher, I had good teachers around me, but one teacher down the hall taught the Civil War the entire year because he loved the Civil War. Had another teacher down the hall that loved women's studies, so she taught that the entire year. This was a U.S. history survey course. So what should a high school student have out of that? He should have basically an understanding of U.S. history basically through a whole continuum. And they didn't have that. There was no accountability. There was no one to basically say, hey, you're doing the wrong thing. You're doing no pacing. You're not teaching some of the basics. And frankly, that was the era of, to me, group work, which can be good. I did a lot, but it was sort of, you know, let's sit around in a group and let's ask your opinion of something, even if you have no core knowledge. So the challenge today is there are 34 SOL tests. I do think that's too many. The testing protocol is getting to be too much. You can make some criticism that, and I do think the Board of Education has moved well in this direction. You know, obviously the goal is, can you test more critical thinking skills? For example, I was an AP teacher, advanced placement at the end of my career. You have an essay component, which I think is very necessary, and a multiple choice component. So we need to move in that direction. We obviously have a bill in on the Republican House side that will reduce the number of tests prudently and look at getting at more critical thinking skills. But the challenge is not to let the pendulum go from here to here and then all the way back to here. And so the balancing act is very important to keep the standards, I do think there are core things you need to learn, and I'll end on this. Somebody that wanted to sort of throw it all the way back said, well, we have to teach critical thinking skills, so let me tell you about prime numbers. And she gave this demonstration on how to teach prime numbers. She forgot one thing. She never defined what a prime number was to the kids. And so that's sort of where we were at. So I think a balance between, you know, core fundamental standards and more critical thinking, reduced tests, but still a good cadre of tests is where we need to end up. And that will be a challenge because people come to this, I think, this issue with sort of different motives.
Pop quiz, who's the one member of the General Assembly who has actually taken an SOL?
Oh, it's got to be Joseph.
Yeah.
You got it right.
Yeah.
You got it right.
He told me the other day.
You know, very interesting. 1991 you had come in the election before, but I introduced a bill we referred to back then as the Education Accountability Act that had this as its intent. And I was told that it was premature, so I thanked them for saying it was ahead of its time. But in 1995-ish, around about there, George Allen began to work with us on it, and its purpose is what it ought to be. And yes, there's probably too many tests there, but we do need to have that testing of core knowledge. And the thing that really concerns me is that they teach to the test. I know it seems natural that they should, but no, if you want long-term gain, then you just accept that as being the basic knowledge that they need to have, that they're going to be tested on, but don't teach to it, or they lack the critical thinking skills and the greater understanding that they need to have in order to progress to the next levels. It's not just knowledge that you need to have, which we can test knowledge more easily. It's the understanding and the critical thinking skills that come out of that. What do you reach the right conclusions from the knowledge that you have?
Right. Sticking to education, what's been the reaction to two signature initiatives last year that are now law? The first one being the authority of the state to take over a failing school district, number one, and number two, the grading of school districts.
They're both under attack.
Well said.
They're both under attack. You know, I happen to think that they're both very important. There are 6 schools in the state in which the students are having to go to the schools for economic conditions primarily. They can't afford to move elsewhere, and their families can't afford tuition in private schools. And the schools aren't even certified. They're not even meeting, you know, basic educational demands in the schools. So we should not be forcing children to go to schools like that. And somebody has to step in and hold accountability, and it's part of what we're talking about here. So I appreciate the system that was set up, and I know we're going to do some modifying. We're going to do some amending. I supported some amendments to change that so that we know we're only talking about those schools that aren't certified. Now, on the other one, on the grading system, I know it's tough. It's tough having to have your school graded similarly to a report card, and maybe there needs to be some modifications. I mean, I've asked from the Board of Education, the Board of Education department to share with me the criteria that they're actually using to determine the A through F, and then getting a sampling of what the different schools are, so I can since the effect. But bottom line, if we make it too complicated to the end user, that person that looks at it and says, what judgment should I make from it, it's not serving its purpose. And it needs to be, we need to try to present it as simply as we present report cards on the kids.
Great. I noticed the governor wants to take charge. He wants the General Assembly now to pass a bill that will allow him to decide whether Medicaid is expanded. I think we know what that result would be. Talk to us about the pros and cons of Medicaid expansion for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Well, the Republicans in the House of Delegates have been very clear, and we've really been clear the last 5 months, that we are not interested in expanding Medicaid. And there are several reasons for that. The Merck Commission basically is a commission made up of House and Senate members that are sort of charged of looking at that. That commission is actually codified. And so really the responsibility, if you're going to expand Medicaid right now, is within that commission. It takes a majority of House members and a majority of Senate members. And I know from the House side there is no interest this year in doing that. Now, having said that, it does need to be reformed. And the Merck Commission is looking at several reforms, everywhere from Medicaid fraud to sort of, you know, both sort of dually eligible, those that are eligible for both Medicare and Medicaid. There's some savings if that's done correctly. That process has just started. We want to see the implementation of some of those reforms and see if they really work. But I want to get beyond that. We have more problems than just that. I mean, currently the federal government says they're going to fund these new expanded Medicaid enrollees by 100%, and then 2016 I think is 90%. We have no confidence they have the money to do that. If they fund it at the current 50-50 ratio, that's about $1 billion to $2 billion a year that will fall on the state. So we have no confidence that the national rollout has worked on all kinds of levels, and then to expand Medicaid, we feel like at this point is a real mistake. And that will be a real bone of contention with the governor. I mean, he's very serious. We're very serious about this issue.
Not worth the risk of taking, what, $2.1 billion a year for the first 3 years?
Well, we'd like to have the money, okay? And I don't blame the providers, especially, I know both the urban hospitals and the rural hospitals are saying, we need this money, and they're going to be the end recipients of it. Of a large share of it, and we've got rural hospitals that aren't working on the margins. I mean, don't have the volume, so they're working on small margins. And we've even had one close in Southwest Virginia. I can appreciate the demand for the money and the desire for it, but Kirk is right on the point of the feds are not going to be able to live up to their promise. They're just not, and we have to realize that if we expand Medicaid, then very shortly we're going to have to, the burden is going to be on us as to whether or not we're going to keep paying that couple of $1 billion and more that we'll be paying out per year, or are we going to tell them they're not insured? Now, it's another approach that people are talking about is to let the premiums go to pay for private sector coverage, of which then the private sector would say to them, hey, sorry, you're not insured because your premium's not paid.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you for being with us. I'm Majority Leader Cox and Mr. Chairman, Senator Steve Martin.
Thank you.
I hope to see you in the future.
Look forward to it.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians with their government. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.